This movie is about absolute references, which we're going to take a look at. We're going to build an absolute reference, and mixed references. So, absolute references and mixed references. Mastering this concept can yield benefits by way of making your spreadsheet building tremendously easier. To illustrate the point, I've got a couple of tables set up. I've got a couple of tax tables, some sales amounts. In the first table, I've got only one rate, it's 5%. In the second table, I've got three rates, 5, 6, and 7%. And then I also have a multiplication table. I have a formula in the active cell, C8. Pressing F2, it's B8 times C6. I'm trying to find out the tax associated with the sale amount. The sale's $100, the tax rate's 5%, it's $5. I want to fill out the rest of this schedule, the rest of this table. There's a couple of ways to do it. Here's a bad way to do it. Equal left click 150 times 5%, control enter. I get the correct amount, but I've got 16 amounts in two columns that I'm trying to get the answer for. So that means I have 16 formulas to manually input into each one of those cells. Well, there's a much better way to do it. I'm going to delete that, go back up to C8, press the F2 key, and select C6. We're going to make C6 an absolute reference. And in the process, I'll show you what an absolute reference is and what its value can be. An absolute reference is defined when you put a $ in front of the cell address, C6, $C, $6. I've now made C6 an absolute reference. So what does that mean? I'm going to control enter. It doesn't mean anything for the value that's generated from the formula in this cell, but what it enables me to do is to control C, copy, move down one space, enter, and I didn't have to rebuild the formula. That formula that I had in C8 also works in C9. I get the correct result because I've made C6 an absolute reference, and so whether I'm in C8, F2, C6 is being multiplied by the sale amount, or whether I'm in C9, F2, C6 is multiplied by the sale amount. It's a different sale amount. It's in B9 now. Now, knowing this, I can control C to copy, select my range, hold down the control key, select my other range that I want that formula to be in, and hit enter, and I get the tax associated with each one of those sale amounts and fill out my schedule with just a couple of clicks. One thing I want to point out is half of the formula is an absolute reference and the other half is a relative reference. B8 is a relative reference. B8 is referencing the cell to the left of C8. And when I copied the formula over to F8, the first part of the formula is now E8 instead of B8, but it is the cell to the left of where the formula is. The color coding makes it nice to see that. It's the blue boxed cell, and it's the blue boxed cell. The absolute reference part is the part that references C6. And when I copy the formula anywhere on this worksheet, wherever that formula is, it's still going to reference in the second part of the formula, C6. So that's great. That's an absolute reference. I'm going to go down here and select C22 and left click and make C20 an absolute reference in the quickest way that you can do it, which is to press F4. Control enter. I get the right number. 5 is 5% of 100. Control C, go down, enter. That's the correct number as well. But what is 6% of 150? Control C, arrow over to the right, enter. It's not 0.375. So what happened? Well, a couple things happened. This formula is completely wrong for filling out this schedule. When I press F2, you can see that the formula is referencing first the cell to the left of the cell containing the formula. It's a relative reference, and then the other part of the formula has an absolute reference to C20. Well, I don't want either one of those things in the formula in this cell in D23. I want to multiply 150 times 6%. So how do I do that by controlling the references? Well, I need a mixed reference. I'll escape out of that, delete those two formulas, go back up to our original formula, and walk through the steps of what we actually need. I'm going to left-click C20 and show you that one click of F4 will make a relative reference an absolute reference, as we just saw. Another click will make it a mixed reference, where the row is absolute. One more click will make the column absolute, and another click will bring it back to its original state, which was a relative reference. So between those four options, we should be able to figure out what part of the formula we need to be fixed and what part of the formula we need to float with the movement of the formula. Let's start with the first part, B22. Since all of my sales amounts are in column B, I'm going to guess that maybe I need to make B an absolute reference. Pressing F4 once, it's all absolute. Again, the row is absolute. One more time, the column is absolute. I'm going to move to C20 and use the same logic, where since all of my rates are in a row, I'm going to make the row absolute. Pressing once, it's all absolute. Again, the row is absolute. Control Enter. Of course, I get 5%. That's going to be right. The real test is copying. So I'm going to Control C and select my whole grid, Enter. So we get the whole grid filled out with one formula. There's a way to test this quickly, and usually the way I do it is to use F2, and I've used the F2 key throughout several movies. Beginning in the first cell, we know that's correct. Moving over, well, that's correct too. We can see we want 100 times 6%, which is $6. 100 times 7%, moving down, it's 150 times 7%, which is exactly what we want in that location on the schedule. And since those are right, we know all the rest of them are right because the formula is exactly the same. Doing this one more time, we have an even worse situation where we have a 10 by 10 grid. If we were to manually put the formulas in here, we'd have to put 100 formulas in this schedule. But we know we don't have to do that. H8 times I7, we already know how to fix this. 1, 2, 3 with F4, selecting the other part of the formula. 1, 2, Control Enter, Control C, select the entire range, Enter, and we've got our multiplication table filled out. So that's absolute and mixed references. We found out we can use absolute and mixed references by adjusting a relative reference using the F4 key so that our formulas can work within a wider scope and a wider range within our schedules. We looked at a tax rate schedule where we could build an absolute reference so that all of the dollars in the schedule will be multiplied by the same fixed cell. We used a mixed reference to build a matrix table where the value of the cell is determined by what's in the column heading and the row heading. And we used the mixed references again to build a multiplication table.